Us, most people were taught that the Second Boer War was a simple colonial clash in the South African veldt. They remember the British Empire deploying 500,000 troops, fight stubborn Dutch-descended farmers in faded uniforms. Our books focus on the bloody trenches of Spion Kop, the military failures of London, and the eventual annexation of two small republics. It is painted as a war for imperial pride, land expansion, and the voting rights of foreign workers. But this textbook version leaves the most critical ledger is from completely blank. If this was merely a war against small peasant republics, why did London spend over £200 million to secure it? Why did the world's greatest military superpower push its own national debt to the brink for landlocked territory? The surface story is written in gunpowder. But the true mechanism was written in the gold vaults of the Bank of England. To understand why these borders had to bleed, we must leave the battlefield and enter the private chambers of global finance. At 1899, the British Bang On was the absolute anchor of global trade. Every merchant from Shanghai to New York trusted the British currency because of one ironclad promise from the gold standard. You could walk into a bank, present a paper note, and demand its exact weight from in physical gold. At a credit empire, is only as strong as its physical reserves. And in the final decades of the 19th century, London's financial foundation was beginning to dry up. Rising industrial power of the German Empire and the expanding economy of the United States were vacuuming gold from the international markets. The Bank of England, operating on a remarkably thin margin of metal currency. Then, in 1886, everything changed beneath the soil of the Transvaal Republic. Deep within a ridge called Witwatersrand, miners struck the largest deposit of gold ever discovered in human history. It was a mountain of wealth capable of securing the global monetary system a century. But there was a catastrophic geopolitical catch. Gold was located entirely inside an independent, hostile state. The Transvaal, governed by Paul Kruger, from a deeply conservative leader who viewed British financial influence as an existential threat. Kruger refused to let London control the extraction lines. He levied massive monopolies, dynamite and industrial equipment, squeezing the profits of British mining syndicates. The Transvaal began constructing a direct railway line, Alagoa Bay, bypassing British ports, connecting directly with German capital. Financial masters of London watched the data with growing terror. If the world's largest supply of new gold bypassed Lombard Street and flowed into Berlin, the British credit monopoly would disintegrate. Randlords, the mega-wealthy British magnates who owned the deep-level mines, knew that local diplomacy had failed. Men like Cecil Rhodes, who had built empires on diamonds, saw the Witwatersrand ledger as an unfinished conquest. Odds backed by the immense capital of the House of Rothschild began orchestrating a quiet, corporate coup d'etat. Private correspondence sent between the mining boardrooms and the colonial office reveals a chilling calculation. They did not care about the political rights of the British miners in Johannesburg. They cared about the liquidity of the imperial banking system. Alfred Milner, the British High Commissioner in South Africa, became the political weapon for this led financial elite. Milner deliberately escalated diplomatic demands, from pushing the Transvaal government into an impossible corner. High-stakes negotiations collapsed, and it was not an accident. It was the execution of a strategic plan. Colliger demanded bayonets to unlock the vaults. In 1895, the illegal Jameson raid attempted to spark an armed uprising, overthrow Kruger's government. The raid failed miserably, leaving behind a trail of diplomatic scandal, captured, and a box of captured incriminating letters. But the financial machinery could not turn back. The British public was fed waves of propaganda about the mistreatment of British subjects under the Boer regime. But behind the media smokescreen was from the Bank of England, calculating the cost of inaction. October 1899, ultimatums expired, and the first artillery rounds echoed across the border. London expected a swift, decisive victory, a cheap campaign, to settle the ledger. Instead, they walked into a meat grinder. The Boer commandos, using modern smokeless Mauser rifles, massacred the traditional British formations week after week. Cost of the war, England exponentially, draining the very gold reserves London had marched to protect. To break the resistance, the British military turned to a strategy of absolute devastation. General Horatio Kitchener ordered a scorched earth policy, burning thousands of Boer homesteads and slaughtering livestock. They built the first modern concentration camps, wire-fenced enclosures where tens of thousands of women and children perished from starvation and disease. The human invoice for saving the gold standard was paid in the dust at these camps. By 1902, the Republic surrendered, and the Witwatersrand mines were officially incorporated into the British Empire. London won the war and secured the flow of gold, maintaining the dominance of the British pound until World War I. But the victory was a financial tragedy. A debt-fueled victory permanently weakened the empire's long-term stability. History records the names of the generals and the text of the peace treaties. But the archives show that the borders of modern South Africa are carved by the pressure of international debt. Empires do not march for glory, they march to balance their books. And the blood spilled in the veldt was simply the interest paid on an imperial credit line. Understand why the British Empire was willing to bleed for the Transvaal, we must look at the mechanics of the imperial finance system. In the late 19th century, the Bank of England did not just print paper money, and it managed the world's ultimate liquidity network. Under the rules of the gold standard, copper currency was merely a ghost, a shadow of the physical metal locked in the vaults. If global markets lost faith in London's ability to convert paper into bullion, the entire credit empire would come crashing down. By 1890, the data in the ledger books was flashing red. Rapid industrial expansion of Imperial Germany and the massive economic growth of the United States were starving London of new gold reserves. While the British Empire controlled vast territories, its central bank was operating on a dangerously narrow margin of physical gold. Then, the geopolitical balance of power was shattered, and tectonic discovery in the South African veldt. Miners struck the Witwatersrand gold reef, a massive geological formation, holding the richest deposits of gold ever found on Earth. Presently, the sleepy, landlocked agricultural republic, led by conservative Dutch-descended farmers, the center of global wealth. For the masters of Lombard Street, this was both an ultimate salvation and an absolute nightmare. The gold was there, millions of ounces of it, but it was locked behind a hostile border, controlled by President Paul Kruger. Kruger understood the predatory nature of British imperial finance. He knew that if the British mining syndicates gained total control of the independence of the Transvaal Republic, would evaporate. So the Boer government began erecting walls of economic defense to protect their sovereignty. They established a state monopoly on dynamite, charging exorbitant prices to the British mining companies for the explosive materials needed to blast the deep-level rock. They imposed heavy taxes on industrial machinery and coal transportation, cutting deeply into the profit margins of the foreign syndicates. The ultimate red line for London, a tax, it was a railway line. Kruger authorized the construction of the Delagoa Bay Railway, a direct transport route connecting Pretoria to a Portuguese port, bypassing the British Cape Colony entirely. This was a deliberate move to shift the Transvaal's economic axis Ostrom, away from London, and toward Imperial Germany. Private correspondence of the period reveals that Berlin was highly interested in controlling Kruger's industrial independence. Financial strategists in London watched the capital flows, Ostrom with growing panic. If the gold of the Witwatersrand was traded in German mark, copper stored in Berlin vaults, British Bong would lose its global monopoly. Corporate boardroom now became the shadow cabinet of the empire. The mega-wealthy magnates who owned the deep-level gold mines, known historical as the Randlords, decided that local laws had to be broken. Men like Cecil Rhodes, deathless diamond tycoon who founded De Beers, saw the Transvaal ledger as an uncompleted piece of empire. Rhodes was not working in a vacuum. His imperial ambitions were backed by the immense capital networks of the House of Rothschild. Letters sent between Rhodes and his financial backers in London often rarely mentioned the voting rights of British workers in Johannesburg. Instead, they analyzed the cost-benefit ratio of an armed intervention, calculated the price of dynamite, the depth of the gold veins, and the necessity of installing a pro-British regime. Victoria. Alfred Milner, the British High Commissioner, was the perfect bureaucratic instrument for this corporate agenda. Milner arrived in South Africa not to negotiate peace, but to engineer an existential crisis. He deliberately exaggerated the grievances of the foreign miners, turning a tax dispute into a grand narrative of imperial humiliation. In his secret dispatches to the colonial office, Milner made the stakes clear: the survival of British supremacy in South Africa tied to the control of the gold mines. When Kruger offered political concessions, Milner deliberately raised the bar, demanding conditions that no sovereign state could accept. The diplomatic theater was carefully managed, the British public for war, while the banks prepared for liquidation. In the winter of 1895, others made their first aggressive move, infamous Jameson Raid. Private paramilitary force, funded by Rhodes and the mining syndicates, invaded the Transvaal, helping to spark an internal uprising. The operation was a catastrophic tactical blunder. Our forces surrounded the invaders, capturing their weapons and a leather case containing their secret codebooks. The raid failed on the battlefield, but it succeeded in setting the kinetic chain reaction. Total war. The ledger had been opened, and it could no longer be closed, by diplomacy. When the smoke cleared on the failed Jameson raid of 1895, the geopolitical stakes became dangerously visible. The surface narrative, told in London newspapers, was one of British victimhood and Boer aggression. But the missing chapter, hidden inside the internal memos of the colonial office, revealed a much colder truth. The British Empire was no longer just dealing with a small agricultural republic. It was facing a direct challenge to its financial supremacy. In January 1896, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany sent a personal wire to Pretoria, known historical as the Kruger telegram. Kaiser congratulated President Kruger, telling the British raiders, without needing to appeal to friendly powers. For the financial architects in London, the telegram was a declaration of monetary war. Imperial Germany formed a direct military financial alliance with the Transvaal. The Witwatersrand gold reef became Berlin's ultimate weapon. The British Bong, which anchored the global gold standard, depended entirely on a constant, massive influx of new bullion. Without controlling the South African mines, of England would watch its liquid reserves dry up completely, while the German mark Fing Lan with global dominance. The ledger books of Lombard Street, were now dictating the movements of the Royal Navy. From behind the closed doors of the London banking houses, the Randlords realized that corporate maneuvering was no longer enough. The massive capital networks, controlled by the House of Rothschild, began adjusting the leverage from of global credit. Private loans to the Transvaal Republic were quietly frozen, suffocating Kruger's ability to import heavy mining equipment from non-British sources. At the same time, Alfred Milner, the British High Commissioner, began tightening the diplomatic noose around Pretoria. Colner's strategy was not to find a compromise, but to force a capitulation. In his private dispatches to Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain, Colner openly admitted that the gold mines were the true prize of the imperial crisis. He wrote that the continuation of an independent Boer republic controlling the world's largest gold supply was an existential threat to the British Empire. Prepared the British public for a massive military mobilization, thus launched a targeted campaign of imperial propaganda. The newspapers focused heavily on the denial of voting rights to the thousands of British migrant workers in Johannesburg, known as the Uitlanders. The surface story, was framed as a moral crusade, democracy, and worker rights. But the internal ledgers from the mining syndicates showed that these workers were merely political pawns and used to trigger a conflict. The mining magnates did not want their workers to vote. They wanted the British military to clear the tax barriers and dissolve the dynamite monopoly. In the summer of 1899, the financial pressure economy had pushed both economies to the absolute brink. British troops began massing along the borders of the Natal and Cape colonies, aiding and physical blockade around the Boer republics. President Paul Kruger, recognizing that the British ultimatums were designed to strip the Transvaal of its sovereignty, chose to strike first. In October 1899, brewing financial crisis officially transformed into a kinetic war. The initial British strategy, led by General Redvers Buller, assumed that a modern industrial army would easily crush a militia of farmers. But the ledger of war is rarely predictable. The Boer commandos, utilizing the vast open spaces of the veldt and modern smokeless Mauser artillery, mustered the British lines in a series of devastating engagements known as Black Week. Also, Magersfontein and Stormberg, the British forces suffered thousands of casualties, other traditional tactics pulverized by mobile guerrilla units. The news sent shockwaves through the London Stock Exchange. The price of British imperial bonds plunged sharply as investors realized the campaign would not be a cheap colonial police action, but a long, draining war of attrition. The Bank of England was suddenly forced to export massive amounts of its own gold reserves to fund the deployment of hundreds of thousands of reinforcing troops. The very liquidity that London had marched to protect was now being liquidated in the dust of the battlefield. In the tide of the conflict, the British government replaced their high command, bringing in Field Marshal Lord Roberts and General Horatio Kitchener. Kitchener brought a new, logic to the ledger of war. If the Boer commandos could not be beaten in open battle, their entire economic infrastructure would be systematically destroyed. The Irish Army initiated a scorched earth policy, burning down over 30,000 Boer homesteads, slaughtering millions of sheep and cattle, and poisoning local water wells. The entire countryside transformed into a barren wasteland, trying to starve the guerrilla fighters into submission. But the most dark innovation of the campaign was the creation of the concentration camps. To prevent the civilian population providing food and intelligence to the commandos, the British military swept up tens of thousands of women, children, and native African laborers, packed them into crowded, poorly provisioned tent cities surrounded by barbed wire. Inside these camps, disease, typhus, and severe malnutrition spread with terrifying speed. The administrative logs of the British camp inspectors noted the daily death tolls, called bureaucratic precision. All 26,000 Boer women and children perished inside the enclosures, alongside more than 14,000 native Africans had been weaponized as forced mine labor. The human invoice for securing the Witwatersrand gold reef was being written in the mass graves of the South African camps. Back in London, the ethical cost of the war sparked intense political battles, but the financial machinery did not stop. The empire had already borrowed over £150 million, private banking consortiums, Bob to keep the military machine running. Alt, the invasion now, that is from would mean in complete default, odds on the imperial credit lines, us, and the immediate collapse of the global